The small town of Willow Creek was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. Nestled between rolling hills and a winding river, it had an air of quiet charm that made people proud to call it home. The streets were lined with old oak trees, their branches stretching over sidewalks like protective arms. On sunny afternoons, children played in the parks while older folks sat on benches, chatting about the weather or sharing stories from days gone by. In this peaceful setting lived Richard Lane, a man whose name carried weight in every corner of the town. He was tall with sharp features and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through people. His suits were always perfectly tailored, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. People admired him for his success. He owned several businesses, including the largest factory in the area, but they also whispered behind closed doors about how cold he could be. Richard didn't smile much, and when he did, it rarely reached his eyes. Richard had 2 daughters, Emma and Jasmine. Emma was 16, with blonde hair and pale skin that matched her father's. She was popular at school, always surrounded by friends who envied her perfect life. But Jasmine, 18, was different. Her dark complexion and curly black hair stood out in their mostly white community. She wasn't Richard's biological child. She had come into his life when he married her mother, Claire, years ago. After Claire passed away unexpectedly, Jasmine became part of Richard's family officially. Though Jasmine tried hard to fit in, she often felt like an outsider. At school, some kids teased her for being different, and at home, Richard treated her more like a guest than a daughter. He never yelled at her or hit her, but there was always a distance between them. It wasn't just because of her race, it was deeper than that. Jasmine sometimes caught him looking at her with a strange expression, one that made her feel uneasy, though she couldn't explain why. On a chilly autumn evening, Richard announced that he would take both girls out for dinner. This was unusual. He rarely spent time with them outside of holidays or special occasions. Still, Emma was thrilled. "Where are we going?" she asked excitedly, as they climbed into the sleek black car parked in the driveway. "Somewhere nice," Richard replied curtly, adjusting his tie in the rearview mirror. Jasmine slid into the back seat beside Emma, clutching her bag tightly. Something about the tone of her father's voice made her nervous, though she couldn't put her finger on it. The drive started quietly. Richard kept his focus on the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel with precision. Emma chattered about her day at school, trying to fill the silence, but Richard only nodded occasionally without saying much. Jasmine stared out the window, watching the golden hues of sunset fade into deep shades of purple and blue. The world outside looked calm, almost serene, but inside the car, tension hung thick in the air. After a while, they approached the long bridge that stretched across the river. It was a familiar sight. Willow Creek residents crossed it daily to get to work or visit neighboring towns. Tonight, however, the bridge felt ominous. The metal railing gleamed under the dim streetlights, and the sound of water rushing below echoed faintly through the open windows. Without warning, Richard slowed the car down and pulled over to the side of the bridge. "What's wrong?" Emma asked, her voice tinged with confusion. "We need to talk," Richard said, turning off the engine. His tone was flat, emotionless. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out of the car, leaving the door slightly ajar. The cool breeze swept through the vehicle, sending a shiver down Jasmine's spine. "Stay here," he instructed Emma before walking around to the passenger side. Jasmine watched him approach, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. When he opened her door, she hesitated, unsure of what to do. "Get out," he ordered sharply. Jasmine obeyed, stepping onto the pavement. The wind whipped against her face, stinging her cheeks. She glanced at Emma, who looked equally confused and frightened. "Dad, what's going on?" Emma called out, leaning forward in her seat. Richard ignored her. Instead, he grabbed Jasmine by the arm, his grip firm and unyielding. "You think you can embarrass me?" he hissed, his voice low but venomous. Jasmine shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. I don't know what you mean." "You know exactly what I mean," Richard snapped, tightening his hold. "Ever since your mother died, you've been nothing but trouble, always reminding me of things I'd rather forget." Jasmine struggled to pull away, but he was too strong. Panic surged through her as she realized what might happen next. "Please, don't hurt me," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "I haven't done anything wrong." But Richard wasn't listening. With a sudden burst of force, he shoved her toward the edge of the bridge. Jasmine stumbled backward, her feet slipping on the wet pavement. For a split second, she managed to catch herself, clinging desperately to the railing. She turned her head, searching for help, but all she saw was Richard's cold, unfeeling face. Then, with one final push, he sent her tumbling over the side. Jasmine screamed as gravity took hold, pulling her downward. The world spun around her, the dark sky above, the rushing water below. She hit the surface of the river with a deafening splash, the icy liquid swallowing her whole. Her lungs burned as she fought to stay afloat, the current dragging her farther and farther away from the bridge. Back on the bridge, Emma sat frozen in shock, her hands covering her mouth. "Dad, what did you do?" she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Richard didn't answer. He simply got back into the car, slammed the door shut, and drove off as if nothing had happened. For what felt like hours, Jasmine battled against the merciless river. Every stroke of her arms felt heavier than the last, exhaustion threatening to overwhelm her. Just when she thought she couldn't go on any longer, her hand brushed against something solid, a piece of driftwood floating nearby. Summoning the last of her strength, she clung to it, letting it carry her downstream. Eventually, the current eased and Jasmine found herself washed ashore on a muddy bank. Her body ached, and her clothes clung to her like a second skin soaked through and freezing. Shivering uncontrollably, she crawled onto dry land and collapsed, gasping for breath. When she finally opened her eyes again, she saw lights flickering in the distance. A small diner sat perched along the roadside, its neon sign casting a warm glow in the otherwise desolate landscape. Gathering what little energy she had left, Jasmine dragged herself toward it, hoping against hope that someone inside might help her. As she pushed open the door, a bell jingled softly above her head. The warmth of the diner enveloped her, a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. A few patrons sat scattered around the room, sipping coffee or munching on burgers. Behind the counter stood a woman in her 40s with curly brown hair and a kind smile. Her name tag read Linda. Linda looked up as Jasmine staggered inside, taking in the girl's disheveled appearance. "Oh my goodness, are you okay?" she exclaimed, rushing over to help. Jasmine collapsed into a chair, shaking violently. "Please," she croaked, her voice barely audible. "Help me." And so began Jasmine's journey toward survival, and the unraveling of a truth that would shake Willow Creek to its core. Linda Carter had seen her fair share of strange things during her years working at the diner. Late-night truckers, runaway teenagers, and even a few drunks who stumbled in looking for coffee to sober up. But nothing could have prepared her for the sight of Jasmine that night. The girl was drenched from head to toe, her dark hair plastered against her face and her clothes heavy with water. Her skin was pale, almost gray, and she shivered uncontrollably despite the warmth inside the diner. "What happened to you?" Linda asked gently as she draped a thick blanket around Jasmine's shoulders. The girl didn't answer immediately. She stared at the table, her hands trembling as she clutched the edges of the blanket. Finally, after a long pause, she whispered, "He pushed me." Linda frowned. "Who pushed you? Where?" Jasmine hesitated, tears welling up in her eyes. She didn't want to say his name, but the words came tumbling out anyway. "My dad. He pushed me off the bridge." Linda's heart sank. She glanced around the diner, making sure no one else was listening too closely. Most of the patrons were focused on their meals or conversations, oblivious to the drama unfolding in the corner. Still, Linda knew better than to ask too many questions right away. Instead, she poured Jasmine a steaming cup of tea and set it down in front of her. "Drink this," she said softly. "It'll warm you up." As Jasmine sipped the tea, Linda studied her face. There were bruises forming on her arms, dark, angry marks that told a story of violence. Linda felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Whatever had happened, it wasn't an accident. She leaned in closer, lowering her voice. Do you want to tell me what really happened? Jasmine nodded slowly, her hands still shaking. Between sips of tea and bursts of tears, she recounted the events of the evening. She told Linda about the car ride, the stop on the bridge, and how Richard Lane had accused her of embarrassing him before pushing her into the river. By the time she finished, Linda's jaw was clenched so tightly it hurt. "That man needs to be stopped," Linda muttered under her breath. She reached out and placed a comforting hand on Jasmine's shoulder. "You're safe now. I won't let anything happen to you." Over the next hour, Linda helped Jasmine clean up as best she could. She fetched dry clothes from the lost and found box, a pair of sweatpants and an oversized hoodie, and made sure Jasmine ate something. The girl was hesitant at first, but hunger eventually got the better of her, and she nibbled on a grilled cheese sandwich while Linda kept watch. Meanwhile, back in Willow Creek, Richard Lane was already spinning his web of lies. When he returned home without Jasmine, Emma confronted him immediately. "Where is she?" she demanded, her voice shaking with anger and fear. "What did you do to her?" Richard's expression remained calm, almost indifferent. He hung his coat on the rack and adjusted his tie as if nothing unusual had occurred. "Jasmine decided to run away," he said smoothly. "She's been causing trouble for a while now, and I suppose she finally snapped." Emma stared at him, disbelief written all over her face. "Run away? After what you did? You threw her off the bridge." "I didn't throw anyone anywhere," Richard shot back, his tone sharp. "She's ungrateful, Emma. Always has been. And now she's gone, just like her mother, disappearing when things get tough." Emma wanted to argue, but she didn't know what to say. Part of her wanted to believe her father, to think that maybe Jasmine had left willingly. But deep down she couldn't ignore the image of Richard standing on the bridge, pushing Jasmine over the edge. It haunted her, replaying in her mind like a nightmare she couldn't escape. The next morning, rumors began spreading through Willow Creek. Richard wasted no time painting Jasmine as the villain. At breakfast, he casually mentioned to their housekeeper, Mrs. Harper, that Jasmine had run off after a heated argument. By noon, the news had reached the local grocery store, the post office, and even the high school. People whispered about how difficult Jasmine had always been, how she never seemed to fit in with the Lane family. But not everyone bought into Richard's story. Among the skeptics was Susan Meyer, a journalist for the Willow Creek Gazette. Susan was known for her investigative pieces, often uncovering truths that others preferred to ignore. When she heard about Jasmine's supposed disappearance, something about it struck her as odd. Why would a teenager leave everything behind without telling anyone? And why did Richard seem so eager to dismiss the whole situation? Susan decided to dig deeper. She started by visiting the bridge where the incident allegedly occurred. Standing there, she could see how easy it would be for someone to fall or be pushed into the river below. The current was strong, especially after last week's rainstorms. If Jasmine had ended up in the water, survival would have been unlikely unless she found help quickly. Back at her desk, Susan began reviewing old articles and records related to the Lane family. She discovered that Richard had been involved in several controversial business deals over the years, though none had ever led to legal consequences. His wealth and influence shielded him from scrutiny, but Susan sensed there was more beneath the surface. What secrets might he be hiding? And how could they connect to Jasmine's disappearance? While Susan worked on piecing together the puzzle, Jasmine stayed hidden away in Linda's small apartment above the diner. Linda refused to let her go back to the Lanes' house, insisting it wasn't safe. For days, Jasmine barely left the couch, alternating between crying jags and long stretches of silence. The trauma of the bridge haunted her dreams, waking her up in cold sweats each night. One afternoon, as Linda prepared dinner, she noticed Jasmine staring at a stack of newspapers on the counter. "Are you reading those?" Linda asked, nodding toward the papers. Jasmine shook her head. "No, I don't want to see what they're saying about me." Linda sighed and sat down beside her. "I know it's hard, but you can't hide forever. People need to hear your side of the story. If we don't speak up, Richard will keep twisting the truth." Jasmine bit her lip, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. What if no one believes me? He's rich, powerful. Everyone listens to him. Not everyone, Linda replied firmly. There are good people in this town who care about justice. We just have to find them. That night, Linda called Susan Meyer. She explained the situation carefully, leaving out specific details to protect Jasmine's identity. Susan listened intently, jotting down notes as Linda spoke. By the end of the conversation, Susan was convinced. This wasn't just a runaway case, it was something much darker. The following day, Susan visited the diner under the pretense of grabbing lunch. While there, she discreetly observed Jasmine, sitting in the corner booth, her hood pulled low over her face. Linda caught Susan's eye and gave a subtle nod, signaling that the girl was indeed the missing teenager everyone was talking about. After finishing her meal, Susan approached Linda at the counter. "Can we talk privately?" she asked quietly. Linda nodded and led Susan upstairs to her apartment. Once inside, Jasmine hesitated before stepping forward. "This is her," Linda said, gesturing toward Jasmine. "She's ready to tell you everything." For the first time since the bridge incident, Jasmine opened up to someone outside of Linda. She recounted every detail: the argument, the push, the fall into the river. Susan listened attentively, taking careful notes. By the time Jasmine finished, Susan's mind was racing with possibilities. "This changes everything," Susan said finally. "With your permission, I'd like to write an article exposing what really happened. But you need to be prepared, it's going to get messy." Jasmine exchanged a glance with Linda, then nodded. "I'm tired of being afraid," she said softly. "If this is the only way to stop him, then I'll do it." As Susan left the apartment, determination burned in her chest. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Richard Lane was a powerful man, and taking him down would require courage, evidence, and unwavering resolve. But for the first time in years, Susan felt hopeful. The truth was on their side, and sometimes that was enough to make all the difference. The days that followed Susan Meyer's visit to Linda's apartment were a whirlwind of activity. For Jasmine, it was both terrifying and empowering. She had spent so much of her life feeling invisible, like her voice didn't matter. Now, for the first time, she felt like someone was truly listening. Susan worked tirelessly, piecing together the story bit by bit. She knew the stakes were high. Richard Lane wasn't just any man. He was a pillar of Willow Creek, someone who could crush anyone who dared to challenge him. But Susan also knew that if she played her cards right, she might be able to expose the truth. Linda stayed by Jasmine's side throughout the process, offering comfort whenever the memories of the bridge became too overwhelming. The bruises on Jasmine's arms had faded slightly, but they still served as a painful reminder of what she'd been through. Linda often found herself wondering how someone could do such a thing to their own child. Even though Jasmine wasn't Richard's biological daughter, she was still family, or at least she should have been. While Susan focused on gathering evidence, Linda encouraged Jasmine to write down everything she remembered about that night. "It'll help you remember the details," Linda explained, "and it'll give Susan something solid to work with." Jasmine hesitated at first, unsure if she wanted to relive those moments again. But eventually, she picked up a pen and began writing. At first, the words came slowly, each sentence feeling heavier than the last. But as she kept going, the floodgates opened, and soon the pages were filled with raw emotion. Her fear, her anger, her desperation. Susan, meanwhile, started digging deeper into Richard's past. She visited the courthouse, poring over old records and legal documents. What she found shocked her. Over the years, there had been whispers about shady business deals involving Richard Lane. Some of his companies had been accused of exploiting workers, cutting corners on safety regulations, and even bribing officials to turn a blind eye. None of these accusations had ever stuck, though. Richard always managed to slip away unscathed, his reputation intact. But Susan noticed something else, a pattern of behavior that stretched back decades. Richard had a history of distancing himself from people who reminded him of mistakes or failures in his life. There were rumors about an affair he'd had years ago, long before he married Claire, Jasmine's mother. The woman involved had reportedly tried to confront him publicly, only to vanish shortly afterward. No one knew what happened to her, and the case had been quietly swept under the rug. Susan's instincts told her this wasn't a coincidence. She decided to dig further into Richard's personal life, starting with Claire. If Jasmine was telling the truth about being biologically related to Richard, then there had to be proof somewhere. Susan reached out to old friends and co-workers of Claire's, hoping someone might shed light on her relationship with Richard. One name kept coming up. Margaret Ellis, Claire's best friend before she passed away. Margaret now lived in a small town 2 hours away, but when Susan called her, she agreed to meet. The drive gave Susan time to think, to piece together the fragments of the puzzle she was assembling. By the time she arrived at Margaret's modest home, she was brimming with questions. Margaret was an older woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair. She greeted Susan warmly and invited her inside. After offering her a cup of tea, Margaret listened intently as Susan explained why she was there. When Susan mentioned Claire's name, Margaret's expression softened. "Claire was one of the kindest souls I've ever known," she said wistfully. "Her death broke my heart." Susan nodded sympathetically. "I'm sorry for your loss, but I need to ask you some difficult questions. Did Claire ever talk to you about Richard?" Margaret hesitated, then sighed. "Yes, but not in a good way. Claire loved him, at least she thought she did, but their marriage wasn't perfect. Richard treated her well when things were going his way, but if she crossed him, he could be cruel. And then there was Jasmine." Susan leaned forward, her pen poised over her notebook. "What about Jasmine?" Margaret looked uneasy, as though debating whether or not to share what she knew. Finally, she spoke. "Jasmine wasn't adopted, not really. Claire confided in me once. She said Jasmine was Richard's child from another relationship. He didn't want anyone to know, so they pretended she was adopted after Claire agreed to raise her." Susan's heart raced. This was the missing link she'd been searching for. If Jasmine was Richard's biological daughter, it added a whole new layer to the story. It explained why Richard might have resented her so deeply. She was a living reminder of a secret he'd gone to great lengths to bury. Back in Willow Creek, Emma Lane was beginning to unravel. Her father's lies gnawed at her conscience, making it impossible to focus on anything else. She couldn't stop thinking about the look on Jasmine's face as she fell off the bridge, the terror, the betrayal. Emma had always idolized her father, believing him to be strong and infallible. But now, cracks were forming in that image, revealing a man capable of unspeakable cruelty. Determined to find answers, Emma began sneaking into her father's study late at night. She knew he kept important documents locked away in a filing cabinet, but she also knew where he hid the key, in the bottom drawer of his desk. One evening, while Richard was out attending a business dinner, Emma crept downstairs and retrieved the key. Her hands trembled as she unlocked the cabinet, her heart pounding in her chest. Inside, she found stacks of papers, contracts, financial records, letters. Most of it meant nothing to her, but then she stumbled upon something that made her blood run cold. It was a letter written by her late mother, addressed to Richard. The handwriting was shaky, as though Claire had been crying as she wrote it. "Richard," the letter began, "I can't keep living this lie. Jasmine deserves to know the truth about who she is, and so do you. You may try to erase her from your life, but she will always be a part of you. Running from the past won't change that." Emma read the letter over and over, tears streaming down her face. Everything clicked into place. The distance between Richard and Jasmine, his coldness toward her, the way he always seemed uncomfortable around her. Jasmine wasn't just an inconvenience. She was a reflection of Richard's guilt, a constant reminder of a mistake he wanted to forget. The next morning, Emma confronted her father. She waited until they were alone in the kitchen, then slammed the letter down on the table in front of him. "Explain this," she demanded, her voice shaking with anger. Richard froze, his coffee mug halfway to his lips. For a moment he looked genuinely surprised, but then his expression hardened. "Where did you find that?" he asked sharply. "That doesn't matter," Emma snapped. What matters is that you lied to us, to me. Jasmine isn't adopted, is she? She's your daughter. Richard set his mug down carefully, his movements deliberate. That's none of your concern, he said coldly. Claire made her choice and I honored it. End of story. No, it's not the end, Emma shouted, her voice cracking. You threw her off a bridge, Dad. How can you live with yourself? Richard's eyes narrowed, and for a split second, Emma saw a flicker of fear in them. But it disappeared just as quickly, replaced by his usual mask of indifference. You don't understand, he said dismissively. Jasmine was a problem, a complication I didn't need. She would have ruined everything. Emma stared at him, horrified. The man standing in front of her was a stranger, someone she barely recognized. Without another word, she turned and ran upstairs, locking herself in her room. She felt sick to her stomach, torn between loyalty to her father and love for her sister. For the first time in her life, she realized she couldn't stay silent anymore. Meanwhile, Susan was putting the finishing touches on her article. She had gathered enough evidence to paint a damning picture of Richard Lane, not just as a neglectful father, but as a manipulative, dangerous man who would stop at nothing to protect his secrets. With Jasmine's permission, Susan included excerpts from her handwritten account of the bridge incident, giving readers a first-hand glimpse into the trauma she had endured. When the article hit the stands the following week, it sent shockwaves through Willow Creek. People were outraged, demanding answers and accountability. Richard's carefully constructed facade began to crumble brick by brick. For Jasmine, it was a bittersweet victory. The truth was finally out, but the scars, both physical and emotional, would take much longer to heal. As the town grappled with the revelation, Linda stood by Jasmine's side, reminding her that she wasn't alone. This is just the beginning, Linda said firmly. You've got a lot of fight left in you, and we're going to make sure justice is served. Jasmine nodded, a spark of determination igniting within her. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to feel a glimmer of hope. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to let Richard Lane silence her ever again. The article Susan Meyer wrote for the Willow Creek Gazette spread like wildfire. Within hours, it was picked up by larger newspapers and online news outlets across the state. The headline, "Wealthy Businessman Accused of Attempted Murder After Pushing Adopted Daughter Off Bridge," grabbed attention everywhere. People were shocked, outraged, and eager to learn more about Richard Lane's dark secrets. In Willow Creek, the reaction was even stronger. For years, Richard had been seen as a pillar of the community, a successful businessman who created jobs and donated to local charities. But now his carefully crafted image was crumbling. Neighbors whispered behind closed doors, wondering how they hadn't seen the truth sooner. Some felt guilty for believing Richard's lies about Jasmine running away. Others were furious that such a powerful man could act with impunity for so long. Richard tried to brush off the accusations at first. He held a press conference outside, his mansion standing tall in an expensive suit with a confident smile plastered on his face. "This is nothing but a baseless attack," he declared, his voice steady and calm. "Jasmine is troubled, unstable. She fabricated this story because she resents me. I raised her, gave her everything she has, and this is how she repays me." But not everyone bought his act. Cameras flashed as reporters shouted questions, their skepticism evident. One journalist asked, "If Jasmine is lying, why hasn't she contacted you or returned home?" Richard hesitated for a fraction of a second before responding, "I don't know where she is. That's the truth." His answer only fueled more suspicion. If Jasmine really was missing, why wasn't Richard actively searching for her? Why did he seem so unconcerned? Back at Linda's apartment, Jasmine watched the press conference on TV with a mix of fear and anger. Seeing her father deny what he'd done made her stomach churn. "He's good at lying," she muttered bitterly. Linda sat beside her, holding her hand tightly. "Don't let him get to you," Linda said firmly. "People are starting to see through him. His lies won't hold up forever." Susan continued working tirelessly to build a stronger case against Richard. She reached out to other potential victims, people who might have been harmed by Richard's actions over the years. Slowly, Stories began emerging. A former employee claimed Richard had fired him after discovering he planned to report unsafe working conditions. A woman who once worked as a housekeeper for the Lanes revealed that Richard had yelled at Claire during arguments, sometimes throwing things when he lost his temper. Each new account added weight to the growing mountain of evidence against him. Meanwhile, Emma wrestled with her own feelings. She couldn't stop thinking about the letter she'd found, the one written by her late mother. Claire's words haunted her. "You may try to erase her from your life, but she will always be a part of you." Emma realized now just how much her father hated being reminded of his past mistakes. And Jasmine, whether he admitted it or not, was living proof of those mistakes. Emma decided she couldn't stay silent any longer. One evening she called Susan Meyer, asking to meet in secret. They arranged to talk at a quiet park on the outskirts of town. When they met, Emma handed Susan a folder filled with documents she'd taken from her father's study. "These might help," Emma said quietly. "There's stuff about business deals, legal disputes, and letters from my mom. Please, use whatever you can to stop him." Susan thanked her, promising to protect her identity as long as possible. With Emma's help, Susan uncovered even more damning information. Among the papers was proof that Richard had bribed officials to cover up safety violations at his factory. There were also emails showing he'd threatened employees who dared to speak out against him. It became clear that Richard wasn't just a neglectful father. He was a dangerous man who believed he was above the law. As the investigation gained momentum, pressure mounted on local authorities to take action. Protesters gathered outside the police station demanding justice for Jasmine. Signs read, "Believe survivors" and "No more secrets." The chief of police, aware of the public outcry, finally agreed to reopen the case. Officers visited Linda's diner, speaking with Jasmine in private. For the first time, Jasmine told her full story to law enforcement, describing every detail of the night on the bridge. Detectives also interviewed Emma, who broke down in tears as she recounted witnessing her father push Jasmine off the bridge. Her testimony was crucial. It provided first-hand evidence that contradicted Richard's claims. By the end of the week, Richard Lane was arrested and charged with attempted murder. The arrest sent shockwaves through Willow Creek. Some residents cheered, relieved that justice seemed within reach. Others remained cautious, worried about backlash from Richard's allies. Still, the tide had turned. Richard's wealth and influence no longer shielded him completely. At the family estate, chaos reigned. Reporters camped outside the gates, snapping photos and shouting questions. Inside, Emma struggled with guilt and fear. She knew testifying against her father would tear their family apart, but she couldn't live with herself if she stayed silent. Late one night, she packed a small bag and left a note for her father. "I'm sorry, but I can't keep protecting you. The truth matters more." She went to stay with a close friend, knowing she wouldn't be safe at home. Without Emma around, Richard grew increasingly isolated. His lawyers worked overtime to discredit Jasmine and Susan, accusing them of fabricating the story for attention. But the evidence against him was overwhelming, and public opinion was firmly against him. Decree. Trial began 2 months later. Jasmine, now stronger and more determined than ever, took the stand. Her voice trembled as she described the events of that fateful night, but she didn't waver. She looked directly at Richard, refusing to let him intimidate her. "He pushed me off the bridge because he hates who I am," she said firmly. "But I'm still here and I won't let him win." Emma followed, her hands shaking as she recounted what she'd seen. Tears streamed down her face as she apologized to Jasmine for not speaking up sooner. "I was scared," she admitted. "But I know now that staying silent was wrong. My dad hurt you and I'll never forgive him for that." Richard's defense team tried to paint Jasmine as unstable and vengeful, but their arguments fell flat. The prosecution presented the evidence Susan had gathered, documents, emails, witness testimonies, all pointing to Richard's guilt. The jury deliberated for 3 days before delivering their verdict, guilty on all counts. When the judge sentenced Richard to 25 years in prison without parole, the courtroom erupted in applause. Jasmine cried tears of relief, hugging Linda and Susan tightly. Outside, supporters cheered as news of the verdict spread. For many, it was a victory not just for Jasmine, but for anyone who had ever felt powerless against someone with money and influence. In the weeks that followed, Jasmine began rebuilding her life. With Linda's encouragement, she started volunteering at a local shelter for domestic violence survivors. Sharing her story helped others find courage to speak out about their own experiences. Emma, though estranged from her father, reconciled with Jasmine. The sisters promised to support each other moving forward, determined to heal together. As for Susan, she earned widespread recognition for her role in exposing Richard's crimes. Her article inspired other journalists to investigate similar cases, shining a light on injustices hidden behind wealth and privilege. Willow Creek, once a quiet town oblivious to its darker corners, began to change. Conversations about accountability and equality became commonplace, sparked by the bravery of one young woman who refused to be silenced. Though scars remained, hope blossomed in their place. Jasmine stood on the same bridge where her life had nearly ended, gazing at the water below. This time, however, she wasn't alone. Linda, Susan, and Emma stood beside her, reminders that she had people who truly cared about her. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but Jasmine knew one thing for certain. She was stronger than she'd ever imagined. And no matter what challenges lay ahead, she would face them head on, with truth, resilience, and unwavering determination. The trial changed everything in Willow Creek. What had once been a quiet, unassuming town was now buzzing with conversations about justice, accountability, and the hidden truths behind closed doors. Richard Lane's conviction sent a clear message. No one, not even the wealthiest or most powerful, was above the law. For Jasmine, it marked the beginning of a new chapter in her life, one filled with both challenges and opportunities. In the months following the verdict, Jasmine threw herself into helping others. She started working part-time at the shelter, where she had volunteered, sharing her story with survivors of abuse and trauma. At first, it was difficult to relive the pain of that night on the bridge, but over time, she found strength in connecting with people who understood what she had gone through. Many of them told her how inspiring she was, how her courage gave them hope. It wasn't easy, but Jasmine realized that by speaking out, she could make a difference, not just for herself, but for others who felt trapped in silence. Linda continued to be a constant source of support. She often accompanied Jasmine to community events and meetings, proud of how far the young woman had come. "You're doing something important," Linda would say whenever Jasmine doubted herself. "People need to hear your voice." Emma, too, began finding her footing in this new reality. After testifying against her father, she struggled with guilt and confusion. For years, she had idolized Richard, believing he was invincible. Now she saw him for who he truly was, a man capable of cruelty and deception. But instead of letting that knowledge destroy her, Emma decided to use it as motivation to grow. She joined a youth group focused on social justice, learning more about inequality and systemic issues in their community. Slowly, she started building a new identity, one separate from her father's shadow. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jasmine and Emma met at the park near the river. They hadn't spent much time together since the trial, each dealing with their emotions in their own way. But tonight, they sat side by side on a bench, watching the water ripple under the fading light. "I'm sorry I didn't believe you sooner," Emma said softly, breaking the silence. Her voice wavered, heavy with regret. "I should have stood up for you when he pushed you off the bridge." Jasmine turned to look at her sister, studying her face. There was so much pain there, but also sincerity. "It's okay," she replied gently. "You were scared. We all do things we regret when we're afraid." "But I let him hurt you," Emma insisted, tears welling up in her eyes. "And I'll never forgive myself for that." Jasmine reached out and took Emma's hand, squeezing it lightly. "You helped bring him to justice, that matters. You risked everything to tell the truth, and because of you, I'm still here. So thank you for finally standing with me." Emma nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "I want to keep standing with you," she said firmly, no matter what happens next. Their bond, though strained by years of neglect and misunderstanding, began to heal. Jasmine and Emma promised to stay close, supporting each other as they navigated life without Richard's toxic presence. Together they visited their mother's grave, laying flowers and talking about happier times. Claire's memory became a bridge between them, reminding them of the love and kindness she had always shown. As spring arrived, bringing warmth and renewal to Willow Creek, Jasmine decided to take another step toward healing. With Susan's encouragement, she agreed to participate in a local storytelling event aimed at raising awareness about domestic violence and abuse. The thought of speaking in front of a large crowd terrified her, but she knew it was important. If her words could help even one person feel less alone, it would be worth it. On the night of the event, Jasmine stood backstage, her heart pounding. Linda and Emma were in the audience, along with Susan and a few friends from the shelter. When her name was called, she walked onto the stage, clutching a piece of paper with her notes. The spotlight felt hot on her skin, but she took a deep breath and began. "I used to think my voice didn't matter," she said, her voice steady despite her nerves. "I grew up feeling invisible, like I didn't belong. And then one night, I almost lost my life because someone wanted to erase me completely. But I survived, and not just for myself. I survived because I want to remind everyone here tonight that your voice does matter. Your pain is real, and your truth deserves to be heard." The room fell silent as Jasmine spoke, her words resonating deeply with those who listened. When she finished, the audience erupted into applause, some people rising to their feet. Tears streamed down her face as she stepped off the stage, overwhelmed by the response. For the first time in a long time, Jasmine felt truly seen. Word of her speech spread quickly, drawing attention from beyond Willow Creek. Local news stations covered the event, highlighting Jasmine's bravery and resilience. Offers poured in, invitations to speak at conferences, requests for interviews, even scholarship opportunities. Jasmine accepted a few, knowing they could amplify her message, but she remained grounded, refusing to let fame define her. Meanwhile, Susan Meyer continued her work as a journalist, shining a light on injustices big and small. Her article about Richard Lane earned her national recognition, but she stayed humble, crediting Jasmine and the others who had trusted her with their stories. "This isn't about me," she often said. "It's about giving a voice to those who've been silenced." Back in Willow Creek, the town itself underwent subtle changes. Conversations about privilege, race, and accountability became more common, sparked by Jasmine's courage and Susan's reporting. Community leaders organized workshops and forums, encouraging residents to confront uncomfortable truths and work toward a better future. Though progress was slow, it was undeniable. Richard Lane remained in prison, his appeals denied one after another. Occasionally, reporters tried to interview him, hoping to uncover more secrets or twists in the case, but he refused to cooperate. Behind bars, he seemed smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of his crimes and the loss of control he had once taken for granted. For Jasmine, moving forward meant embracing uncertainty. She enrolled in college classes, determined to pursue a degree in social work. Helping others had become her passion, and she wanted to turn it into a career. On weekends, she returned to the shelter, mentoring younger survivors and teaching them skills to rebuild their lives. Her resilience inspired everyone around her, including Linda, who joked that Jasmine might end up running the place someday. Late one summer afternoon, Jasmine returned to the bridge where her journey had nearly ended. This time she wasn't alone. Linda, Emma, and Susan walked beside her, their presence a testament to the power of solidarity. As they stood overlooking the river, Jasmine felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. "I never thought I'd come back here," she admitted, her voice soft but steady. "But I'm glad I did. It reminds me of how far I've come, and how much farther I can go." Linda smiled, patting her shoulder. "You've already come so far, sweetheart, don't forget that." Susan nodded in agreement. "And remember, you've got a whole team cheering you on every step of the way." Emma looped her arm through Jasmine's, leaning her head against her sister's shoulder. "We're family," she said simply, "and families stick together." Jasmine looked at the faces of the women beside her, strong, compassionate, unwavering, and felt a surge of gratitude. Life hadn't been easy, and it likely wouldn't be in the future either. But she had learned that even in the darkest moments, there was always a glimmer of hope. Sometimes all it took was reaching out, trusting others, and refusing to give up. As the sun set over Willow Creek, casting golden hues across the river, Jasmine made a silent promise to herself. No matter what challenges lay ahead, she would face them with courage and grace. She had survived the worst night of her life, and in doing so, she had discovered her strength. That strength would carry her forward, not just for herself, but for anyone else who needed a reminder that they weren't alone. And with that, Jasmine took a deep breath, turned away from the bridge, and stepped confidently into the future.